and we will first turn it over to President Green, and I would encourage board members along the way. This will be an interactive discussion, so please, board members, ask questions as President Green moves through the presentation.
And board members, if you're online, you'll have to raise your hand or something because you're very small on the screen. So.
Except for you, Dave. Right now, you're quite large.
Florence, will you call the roll, please?
Bill Gilbert.
Here.
Superintendent Critchfield.
Here.
Sean Keogh.
Here.
Dave Hill.
Present.
Kurt Liebeck.
Here.
Kelly Roach.
Present.
Cindy Sidaway.
Here.
And Dr. Clark.
Present. President Green, the microphone is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, President Clark. And thank you for taking the time today to consider our proposal to create a new 501c3 entity that is intended to hold a new affiliate, the University of Phoenix. This past March, the University of Phoenix approached us, as you know, and they're looking to affiliate with a university that shares their desires for student success, innovation, and commitment to its people. And a team of advisors thoroughly reviewed the various aspects of the institution, from accreditation to reputation. And we met their management team that was hired subsequent to their regulatory issues, and we found them to be good, caring people who are focused on providing a quality education experience to their students. Like the U of I, they have a high percentage of first-generation students. They have permanent faculty with longevity that care, and a focus on the student experience. We both recognize that students of all ages and all educational goals will benefit from our affiliation. Shortly, you'll vote on our request to form a 501c3, which will move to acquire the University of Phoenix. And this will just be the first step in the months-long process to closing. But in the end, both institutions will remain independent of one another, but benefit from the synergy of a common goal. We share with the University of Phoenix a vision for student success. The University of Phoenix has worked for the last several years under new leadership to repair its reputation, refocus its efforts, and rebuild itself around the same mission as our University of Idaho, preparing our students to make a difference. And they've accomplished much of that. And they've refocused their efforts on place and time-bound online adult learners. The University of Idaho differentiates itself by making bold moves, leading innovation, and committing itself to high-value education. The higher education landscape is changing. The way we engage and support students is changing. As a land-grant institution, it is imperative that we meet the mission that has shaped us for nearly 140 years, as well as embrace new ways to learn and meet the needs of our students for the next 140 years. While this transaction is more than just a financial decision, we cannot gloss over the fact that in moving from a for-profit to a not-for-profit will enable operational successes to be reinvested in the student and institutions without factoring in returns to investors. So we'll now take you through a short presentation that summarizes the transactions and strategic fit with the goals of our university, the State Board of Education, and statewide education initiatives. That will go over strategic fit, which I will cover here briefly. Then we'll look at the transactional summaries, both from a legal and financial point of view. Then we'll take you through how we're mitigating some of the risks that have been raised. And then we'll take you through the term sheet. Kent Nelson will lead that effort. And then we'll finish with the value to the state of Idaho. So I'd like to start with, why we're interested in doing this and the strategic fit. The Higher Education Task Force in October 2017, their final report had a number of great things in it, but I would point to three that are directly aligned with this transaction: to establish a statewide digital delivery solution, to remove barriers to access for place-bound or time-bound students, and to expand online college delivery to adult learners. So again, these were our strategic initiatives as an institution, as a system, way back in October 2017. And this transaction really helps us achieve those lofty goals. This also meets the U of I strategic objectives. Our educational mission, as I mentioned, the U of I is the state's land-grant university, and our mission has focused on educating Idaho's citizens, outreach to our communities, and research that solves the state's most vexing problems. By affiliating with the University of Phoenix, the U of I has a chance to engage a new and growing student population, older working adults. Through the technological infrastructure of the University of Phoenix, expanding programmatic offerings and building on our synergies, we can even better meet the educational needs of our citizens and our industries. Program and student body diversification. Adult learners are a fast-growing part of the educational landscape, and through our affiliation with the University of Phoenix, we can better serve these students who share the common background with the current U of I students, often being first-generation students. The University of Phoenix's complementary programs add value to all students. As we've reported, we've taken a look at all the programs, and there is some overlap, but not a lot. Everything is very complementary to actually what we're offering as a system. Technology and academic IP, the affiliation with the University of Phoenix will enable the U of I to deliver immediate value above and beyond the U of I's existing online platform to accelerate both the state of Idaho and the university's online education capability and enrollment growth. The robust technology infrastructure and expertise in online student support that the University of Phoenix has long supported will aid our growing online community. And finally, financial stability. The affiliation will diversify our revenue streams, provide greater economic stability for delivery of educational opportunities, and generate positive annual cash flow. Operational successes can be reinvested in all students, providing greater access and success for students. Can we go to the next slide? At this point, I'll turn it over to Kent Nelson and our legal team, and they'll take you through the legal structure.
Thank you. There we go. Forgot the mute button. I was quite brilliant there, but nonetheless. So the formation that we're proposing for New U is as a separate standalone 501c3 entity, which means that the governance structure for the University of Idaho through the Board of Regents remains completely unchanged. With respect to New U, the governance structure starts with the Board of Regents as the sole member of the not-for-profit entity. For example, the permanent board of the 501c3 entity, New U, will be elected by the Board of Regents, but will contain a majority of independent board members, as is a requirement of the U.S. Department of Education and the accrediting agencies. And of course, New U acquires and operates the assets, assumes the liabilities in conjunction with the purchase agreement that we will go through in greater detail upon closing of the transaction. A couple of closing conditions I wanted to point out to you at this juncture because they are existential to the transaction itself. What are that both the accrediting bodies involved, which is the Higher Learning Commission for University of Phoenix and the Northwest Commission for the University of Idaho, must pass off on this change of ownership. The Internal Revenue Service must pass off on 501c3 status of New U, and this is a similar element that we went through when the board established the Strategic Initiatives Fund for the university as part of our earlier Part P3. And then, of course, we don't close unless we're able to successfully finance the transaction. So I would stand for any questions with respect to this structure, recognizing that we will go through many of these things in greater detail when we discuss the term sheet.
Are there any questions from the board members? And it's impossible to see you, so if you have a question, just click your mic on and let us know you want to ask.
President Clark.
Yes,
this is Sean. And I apologize if I'm getting ahead, but I am confused about this slide, and then tab 1, page 1 says the regents serve as the sole member of New U. But in the Articles of Incorporation on page 7, Article 7 says the sole member is the U of I. And then the bylaws on page 10 says the Board of Regents. And so I'm just not an attorney. Can you help me understand and feel comfortable that indeed the sole member of New U is the Board of Regents?
Kent, can you respond? Or
Yeah, yes, President Clark. The University of Idaho, when we reference the University of Idaho and things like contracts and the like, it is always acting by and through the Board of Regents. The Board of Regents is the corporate entity constitutionally created to operate the University of Idaho. And so that reference may lack a little clarity, but they are, for purposes of this transaction, and for purposes of the corporate entity, it is the Board of Regents, which is the governing body of the University of Idaho.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Can you perhaps reiterate, there are really three, it looks like there are 3 stages of the governance structure there, or 2 stages. Starts with the Board of Regents as a sole member, but then there is an election process. At what point does that take place?
So President Clark, members of the board, that is an election that runs through the Board of Regents. And so that will take place when we, in going through the closing, are ready for that. It will certainly need to take place before or in conjunction with the closing, so that this new board is in place when New U commences the operations of the University of Phoenix. It can occur before, and there may well be good reasons to do that. The exact timing is something that we can address as we move through getting ready for closing, which will be an iterative process for sure.
Thank you. Mr. Liebeck.
Dr. Clark, this is maybe a question for Jennifer. Can you just speak to statutory authority we have to be able to set up a 501c3 entity? Where does that come from?
The statutory authority of the regents.
Yes.
Yes, so which is us, right? So do we? So what gives me comfort that we have the authority to set up this new?
So the statutory authority is under the Idaho Nonprofit Corporation Act. And Ken, jump in and correct me if I'm misstating anything. The broader authority for the regents is found in the Constitution.
And that's the authority to actually approve this this proposal. That's different than what Kurt is asking. He's asking the ability to set up the entity.
So the ability to set up the entity is under the Nonprofit Corporation Act. If you're asking about the broader authority for the transaction, the regents are govern the institution through its policies, governing policies and procedures. And to the extent there are applicable policies, they're referenced in the cover sheet for the agenda materials.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions at this point from board members?
Yes, Dr. Clark, I have.
Yes, Cindy.
This is Cindy. I have a question on the liabilities that we would assume. You said there's certain liabilities. Can that be explained a little in more detail?
Kent or President Green?
Thank you, President Clark and Regent Shidaway. We will address more of this as we talk through the terms, the term sheet. But the major point here is that the liabilities that are being assumed are part of the operations, and those are being assumed by the 501c3 corporation, which is a separate legal entity from the regents or from the University of Idaho. So the liabilities will lie within that corporate entity.
Does that answer you, Cindy?
Not totally. I just know there's.
Cindy, we're gonna go into those in detail. The liabilities, I'm assuming, will be a part of Scott's presentation.
Okay,
Under the risk, they better be as a part of the risk section. So I'm
Okay.
sure we will get there in detail.
And there'll be an
Thank you.
opportunity at the end if you need to re-ask.
okay. Thanks again.
Thank you. All right, Kent, are you up now or is it go to someone else?
The next slide, and that would be Brian Boise. We'll talk about the financial structure.
Thanks, President Green. President Clark, Chair Gilbert, members of the board, good afternoon. I'm Brian Boise, CFO for the University of Idaho, and I'll be taking you through the proposed transaction structure. At its heart, the financial structure is actually very straightforward. We propose to issue $685 million of municipal debt that would cover the purchase price of $550 million, a debt service reserve fund of approximately $69 million, a liquidity fund of $26 million, and transaction costs, which are estimated at $40 million. Those numbers total up to the $685 million of new municipal debt we would issue in connection with this transaction. We've negotiated the $200 million of cash will remain in the entity at closing, making the net purchase price $350 million. At this level, the transaction is value accretive on day one, given that our due diligence advisors provided business enterprise value ranges of between $485 million and $605 million, depending on the valuation method they employed. So again, $350 million net purchase price as compared to a business enterprise valuation range of between $485 million and $605 million. Importantly, security for the $685 million of new debt exists primarily in the form of liens on Phoenix revenues and mortgages on any physical assets. I want to be clear that the bonds that will be issued in connection with this transaction are issued by the new entity, and they are backed by the new entity with no taxpayer dollars associated with the financing of this transaction. The debt would be structured around level debt service preference with a tax-exempt tranche to be fully amortized over 20 years. We expect that tax-exempt tranche to be approximately 80% of the total debt, although that final percentage will be determined by bond counsel. We also expect a taxable tranche to be fully amortized over 10 years, which is approximately 20% of the total debt. Based on our pro forma results, debt service coverage ratios would be in the range of about 1.8 times, which is well above the expected coverage requirements for the new debt that we expect to come in at between 1.25 and 1.50 times. The University of Idaho may play dual roles in this transaction, both receiving and providing resources depending on the circumstances in any given year. So I'll speak to those points separately. With respect to receipt of resources, the pro forma statements incorporate a guaranteed annual payment of $10 million to the University of Idaho. This payment would be senior to debt service, so this makes it a top priority cash flow. In addition, upon satisfaction of certain requirements like debt service coverage ratios, 25 to 30% of the remaining free cash flow would be distributed to Idaho, and the other 70 to 75% of free cash flow would remain with Phoenix. Just to give you a sense of perspective, through fiscal year 30, based on our pro forma statements, we expect those payment streams to generate between $150 and $170 million for Idaho, again, between now and fiscal 30, and $320 to $340 million for Phoenix. So again, that was with respect to receipt of resources by the University of Idaho. With respect to providing resources, the university is committed to strengthening the credit profile of the transaction only as necessary as we work with our financial advisors and underwriters to market this debt. If necessary, the university has expressed a willingness to provide financial support to the new entity of up to $9.99 million per year that could support debt service or other payment obligations of Phoenix. The university has also expressed willingness to supplement liquidity for the new entity, again, only as needed, by approaching our Strategic Initiatives Fund to provide access to a $25 million line of credit with appropriate return back to the Strategic Investment Fund. Based on total planned liquidity of $226 million and total debt of $685 million, the day one cash to debt ratio should be approximately 33%. I mention this only just to say that for purposes of credit ratings, this ratio is a limiting factor, and as a result, we expect to issue the municipal debt at a BB rating. But with 70 to 75% of free cash flow remaining with Phoenix, as I mentioned a moment ago, we plan to build the balance sheet until the cash to debt ratio reaches 100%, at which time we could consider refinancing the debt with a higher, hopefully investment grade rating, and therefore lower interest cost. Tax exempt rate is currently estimated at 6.5%, taxable rate currently estimated at 8.5%. And finally, the last thing I'll mention with respect to impact on the University of Idaho, based on a Moody's scorecard analysis that we completed in connection with PFM, our financial advisor, we expect the university could see a rating downgrade of 1 notch. That's only 1 notch, from our current rating of A1 down to a likely rating of A2, which is still well within investment grade. We believe this result is possible or likely, as the proposed governance structure assumes the new entity would be included in the University of Idaho financial statements as a blended component unit. That level of integration, at least financial integration between the two entities, would have Moody's counting the new debt issued in connection with this transaction and scoring it essentially as though it were university debt, although importantly, to be clear, it is not university debt. That concludes my comments on this slide, and I'll turn the presentation back over to President Green to talk about risks and mitigants associated.
Brian, before we jump off of that and go back, a couple of questions. So you referenced 226 at the beginning. Is that 200 million plus a working capital adjustment assumed to be 26 million?
So we do have $200 million that we've negotiated to have left in the entity.
But then you're going to have a normal working capital adjustment, I would assume, on top of that, correct?
Correct, but the other $26 million is actually funded through the debt issue. It's part of the $685 million. Okay. All of that in addition to regular working capital adjustment.
And and do you have an idea? Because when we think about sort of cash need and cash flow, if the university is stepping in and potentially backstopping through the SIF some, a line of credit, what kind of working capital adjustment you think could potentially be there in addition to the 200 million?
Well, in the neighborhood of about $150 million, we've done pro forma analysis and accounted for the seasonality of cash flows. Right. And based on our initial results here, we're measuring a low point of about 160 to 165 million, which still puts us far north of the 45 to 60 day cash on hand requirement, which is about 118 million. So we don't anticipate needing access to the $25 million line of credit from the SIF. It is simply there as perhaps a possible credit enhancement if needed at the time we issue debt.
Are there other questions on the financial structure from board members?
I have one, Linda.
Yes.
Brian, the cash flow to New U through fiscal year 30, you estimate between 320 and 337. Is that after we've paid down and amortized the debt, or is that before?
That is after we've made debt service payments. So we're talking about free cash flow after debt service payments and after the $10 million upfront payment to the university, which sits above the line.
And that's assuming a 25% share?
Correct. And you can see the ranges in here that take those assumptions into consideration. And we're currently building our proposed transaction around between 25 and 30% of that free cash flow moving to the University of Idaho.
And there will be a decision of New U board, assuming, if financial performance stays where it is and margins and others kind of remain the same. As you said, you get to once you get to that debt service coverage, that you get to that 1-to-1. Is there going to be an opportunity then for that board to increase essentially that percentage or a waterfall to the university?
Well, I would say the answer to that question is absolutely yes. There are no other commitments against that free cash flow. I would perhaps ask Kent to comment on how we would structure that legally so that we could ensure we have that level of protection, but there are no other commitments against that free cash flow. So from the finance perspective, the answer to that question is yes, we could restructure that.
The heart of the question is really the opportunity for additional dollars to flow back essentially to the university, to the state of Idaho, over and above that 25%.
Yeah, board member Gilbert, the answer to your question is yes. And I think the question will be at that time, where's the best use of that capital? Right. Is it continuing to invest in the systems that are world-class systems at the University of Phoenix, or for the strategic objectives of the U of I? And I think that would be something the board would have to discuss and determine on that day. But to your point, there's nothing that says it has to be stuck at these levels. The board could change those distributions. But the way it is set up, the $10 million that comes annually to the U of I comes up, is superior to all of that, and that will come first, and everything else. Then right. After all the debt service, whatever's left over, that board would be able to make a determination on how that is going to be split up.
To that point, this is Callie. Could we potentially pay, or the new board potentially pay down debt earlier if things are very successful? Would that be an option in this agreement?
Yeah.
So we have contemplated call dates on the debt to allow some flexibility. And of course, our original thought here was that as we build the balance sheet for New U, we could qualify for a higher credit rating, refinance the debt at lower interest rates. So yes, we would have those opportunities.
Are there other questions? Okay, President Green.
Thank you. So now we will talk about some of the mitigation strategies that we have for the risks, and speaking to Regent Sidaway's question, yes, we are taking on liabilities. We'll talk about some of them here. The two probably largest liabilities, really are around Title IV legal issues and leases. We've taken a hard look. Ernst & Young has taken a hard look at the leases, and we're very comfortable where we are now. As you know, the University of Phoenix has been closing down their physical campuses. There's a little bleed over until next year, but not much. And other than their Phoenix campus, which is where their headquarters are and their administration will remain, there's not a lot of additional risk beyond that. So the risks that we've identified beyond that are the financial markets. Sometimes, and we're in kind of a turbulent time now, and sometimes the financial markets, aren't as liquid to place your debt. The good news is that the tax exempt municipal market, rarely closes, and so we expect that we will do well there. But the taxable bond market is not always the case. It can close for a few weeks sometimes when there's a lot of turmoil in the markets. So to mitigate that, we've negotiated, and this is a bit different than what we've talked about before. It's better for us, actually. Seller agreed that we could do successful best efforts financing as a condition to closing the legal agreement. So that is a big risk mitigant for us that we have subsequently negotiated in. And there are potential hedging strategies under consideration also that we are looking at to mitigate interest rate risk. So that's how we are managing financial risk in the markets. Title IV liabilities. All universities have to sign what's called a program participation agreement. We're prepared. We sign one every year, and we're prepared also to prepare to sign the PPA for Phoenix, which we would need to do. The regents, would need to do to be financially responsible for those student loans. So how are we managing that? Well, we have contractual and other protective measures to mitigate those exposures, and including financial measures and importantly, insurance contracts. So those we're currently working on getting it in place, and we believe we'll have significant and coverage that will mitigate that risk. And we worked very closely with our regulatory lawyers to assess that, and we're pretty comfortable that we've done a good job at mitigating that risk. Cash flow seasonality, we've talked about that a little bit here, and Brian shared what Bill asked. Regent Gilbert asked the key question there. What do you need, and is there a potential for a working capital adjustment at closing? And the answer is we've ensured that we've got enough cash in the business that we can operate it, under a highly stressed situation if we had to. It's unlikely. In fact, it's remote. We would ever go there. But if we are there, we wanted to make sure that we had enough cash in the business to take care of that. And we've negotiated a very strong cash position in that facility. And then transactional. There's obviously inherent risks in complex acquisition of operating entities. Our lawyers actually have spent days and nights negotiating our reps and warranties, and which of course are as in all transactions like this are covered by R&W insurance. So the key part there, though, is ensuring that all the critical and material issues are properly due diligence so that they are insurable. And we've gone through, and we're pretty comfortable we can get there on all the important ones, but there's still work to be done, and those are also conditions of closing. So we are working through those as we speak. Yes, go ahead.
Dr. Hill?
Yes, Scott. Title IV liabilities. Can you explain a little more and convince me that the potential future liabilities, a simple Google of the University of Phoenix shows potential future liabilities, won't bleed over into the university and how that is managed, your university, and how that is managed, and the reputational risk that goes with that?
Yeah. So, we've negotiated, insurance that we believe can be placed that would be more than sufficient to cover anything that came through. And that's worst case scenario. Leading up to that, we've also reviewed the policies and processes that are employed at Phoenix, the University of Phoenix, to address any concerns that come up around student loans. So if somebody notifies the Department of Education that there's an issue with a student loan, the University of Phoenix has a very robust process where they go back and they pull the information together and submit it back to the Department of Education, and their evaluation of risk is actually much lower than what our attorneys believe it is over their management team. They were looking at 1.5 to, if I recall, around $7 million of potential risk. Frankly, we think it's a bit higher than that, but even if it is, our insurance contracts that we're trying to place are significantly higher than that.
And what are the coverage limit? What's the coverage limit on that, and what's the deductible? And what are you looking at in terms of?
Well, they're not placed yet, Bill.
Right, but generally,
region. But we're looking at over $250 million in coverage just to ensure that we get there. With the deductible could be $40 million, which is one of the reasons we negotiated to put $200 million of cash into the entity.
And placing that insurance is a condition to close, right?
It is, and we're very close to actually buying that policy.
Are there other questions? Go ahead, President Green.
Terrific. Let's go back to that other sheet, though. Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. I did get it. Let's move forward. I apologize. Thank you. So this, now we're going to take you through the term sheet review. Kent, do you want to move forward with that? Kent, you may be on mute.
Thank you, President Green. My screen just changed on me. Hang on. Okay, there we go. Members of the board, we have included in your materials an extensive term sheet that really goes through the terms, the elements of this transaction, and we're going to review this with you along the lines of the classifications that were in the term sheet. So we'll talk a little bit about the parties. We'll talk about the transaction, the financing, specific conditions to closing, which include, as President Green mentioned, the insurance policy for Title IV liability. Also go through the extensive representations and warranties that are inherent in this transaction. Another one of the risk mitigation factors that the contract includes. We'll talk about the covenants included in the contract, and then briefly some additional relatively general terms regarding termination and miscellaneous terms. Before we get into the details, what I would like to do is introduce for you our transaction counsel and regulatory counsel from Hogan and Lovells, and that is John Duke, who is a partner at Hogan and Lovells in their mergers and acquisitions department, and Stephanie Gold, who is a partner at Hogan and Lovells in their higher education mold. And they will be assisting me greatly in this presentation and discussion. In addition, on the line and available for question and comment are Danielle Quaid with Holly Troxel here in Boise, and she should be a familiar face to you. She has advised the university and a number of universities on bonding transactions and debt and the like, as well as Christopher Cook, who serves as our corporate advisor for state corporate law and was our advisor when we set up the Strategic Initiatives Fund, and has served as counsel for that fund, and will be advising us going forward on the establishment of New U. The parties to this agreement are, of course, the University of Phoenix, the operating entity, the corporate entity of University of Phoenix, New U Corporation. Phoenix is the seller, New U is the buyer. Also, for limited purposes, the owners of University of Phoenix, Apollo, and the regents of the University of Idaho are parties to this contract, mostly for purposes of notice and moving the transaction to fruition. The transaction itself, of course, is the acquisition of substantially all the operating assets and assumption of the operating liabilities of New U, of Phoenix by New U, with a purchase price of $550 million. Those assets, we have a list for you, but really the general description is what it takes to operate University of Phoenix comes over. The contract specifically references the unrestricted cash balance of not less than $200 million, and that is in excess of restricted cash reserves and the normal working capital, as Vice President Boise discussed a little bit earlier. And then once again, all of the assets that it takes for University of Phoenix to begin operations the day after the closing in substantially the same way that they were operating the day before closing. I'm going to move. I'm hoping you have this sheet in front of you, because I'm going to move through these relatively generally and certainly be available for questions as it comes along. The next section in the term sheet is the financing section. And of course, the point I want to make here is that this is New U financing. It's not an obligation of the University of Idaho, not an obligation of the regents, nor of the state of Idaho. This is a separate legal entity in that regard, and the liability and responsibility for the financing remains with New U. Successful financing is a financial condition for closing. If we're unable to finance the purchase price, the transaction does not close. And once again, we talk about the contract. The contract discusses the estimated capital raise that this will require, and Vice President Foisey went through these numbers. The purchase price of $550 million, supplemented by working capital liquidity, required reserves, and then the cost of issuance of the debt financing itself. As Vice President Foisey mentioned, there will be liens on all of the assets of New U as collateral for this, and this is something that may be a bit new to the board because we don't have to do that sort of thing for the bond financing that the institutions do. We make a pledge of revenues, but because New U is not a state entity, not a state agency, and this is not a state liability, they will be collateralizing with their assets. The contract addresses the bonding terms similar to, actually, the bonding terms will be estimated in the contract in the same manner that Vice President Foisey went through them with you already. The financial considerations from the university are the university's agreement to stand behind up to $10 million of debt service if necessary, and to seek the contribution of, back up the bus, I'm sorry. These financial considerations are the $10 million that will flow to the university annually from the U, plus the 25 to 30% surplus, and that was discussed through Vice President Foisey as well. There is next the university's agreement to stand behind up to a potential $10 million contingent liability annually for debt service, which will help satisfy the bonding markets and help New U get a better rate. Plus our agreement to request up to $25 million of investment from SIF, which could come in many ways, including a potential line of credit. Whatever funds to get advanced by SIF will be treated as a fund requiring a return, so that the money that flows through this transaction from SIF will continue to make money in the same fashion that SIF makes money with the balance of its funds that it invested for the university out of the P3. In addition, the contract discusses what's called contingent committed financing. The better description for it, really, as this transaction has kind of changed over the negotiations, is a bridge financing. In the event that the bond markets are challenged enough to where we are unable to sell sufficient bonds to make the entire purchase price, or we may have a delay in issuance, but still confidence in the bond market's ability to supply the full purchase price, the university can elect to engage in a bridge loan financing with one of the a financial entity. We've been in discussions with some already.
Well, let me stop you there.
Certainly.
The university, not university, NewCo.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, that's
I appreciate that greatly. Yeah.
And that's the if I heard Scott right, that's the best efforts basis that you negotiated from Apollo. And you'd have time essentially to without this falling out of bed to because of that best efforts basis, Scott, to get that essentially bridge financing in place.
Yes, Regent Gilbert, we have discussed with seller, we would like the bridge financing in place, but not be required to use it if we chose not to. And the best efforts means also, I think, gives us some flexibility on market timing. So, to try to pick our time to go to market. So I think it's all, we're in a really good place. We found that the seller's been very helpful with us in trying to find a fair place where they get some certainty, and yet we're able to ensure that we have a successful offering.
Thank you.
So moving from the bridge financing discussion, there are specific closing conditions, and I will go through some of the simpler ones, and then I will turn this over to our Hogan Levels counsel. The closing conditions are what I call existential to the transaction. These are things that must be in place for this deal to work. And if they're not in place, then the deal doesn't work. Some relatively general ones are that we have compliance with what's called the HSR Act. This is antitrust stuff, and this transaction will be reported to the Department of Justice. No particular reason to believe that there's significant risk here, but it's one that we maintain as a condition if there is a problem. All of the pre-closing educational notices are clean. In other words, we have not gotten back from any of the regulators or the accreditors an indication that they will not approve this transaction, this change of ownership and the operation as we anticipate. There's no government action restraining or prohibiting the transaction, and no civil action restraining or prohibiting the transaction. These are relatively common in all sorts of these sorts of transactions. And then what I'd like to do is turn this over to John Duke, our Mergers and Acquisitions Counsel, who can run through with you this next list of buyer conditions, and then also the representations and warranties that we'll be discussing later. John?
Thanks, Ken. So in addition to the general conditions to both parties closing that Ken went through, there's several conditions for New U that if not satisfied, New U would not have to close. Some of them are fairly standard. Some are very specific to this transaction. The first one would be the reps and warranties of the seller have to be true and correct. The seller has to have performed its terms under the purchase agreement, including satisfying its covenants. There has not been a material adverse effect on the business. So if there was a material adverse effect between signing and closing, closing would not have to occur. All required documents have been executed and delivered. This one is fairly key. The financing proceeds have to have been received by the buyer, sufficient to fund the transaction. In addition, we are seeking and expect to receive representations and warranty insurance policy, so that if any of the representations and warranties turn out not to have been true and correct, there would be ability for the New U to recover on that. Another condition would be that there's no indication from the United States Department of Education or any other agency or creditor that the transaction will be denied. Specifically, it'll require approval by the HLC for the change in control of New U, and also from the University of Idaho's accreditor, Northwest CCU. We will be seeking U.S. Department of Education pre-acquisition review, and another condition coming out of that will be that the U.S. Department of Education would not require a letter of credit in excess of 25% of the Title IV funding. Another condition is that NC SARA approve the transaction, or that educational approvals from each state. NC SARA would enable us, participation with NC SARA would enable us to move forward without having to seek approval in each state in which Phoenix operates. If the Title IV recertification is in process for seller, that they will not receive any sort of pending notice of a denial. There will be as we mentioned, an insurance policy that relates to certain known Title IV liabilities, and having that policy in place will be conditioned to close. There is going to be a condition that Phoenix's EBITDA has not decreased from a prior period, so there's no significant decrease in Phoenix's EBITDA at the time of closing. No indication from any governmental, particularly education regulatory agency, that they would impose conditions that would somehow impair the university's ability to operate post-closing. No pending lawsuits that would prevent the transaction from closing. In addition, and also importantly, New U will have received 501c3 recognition from the IRS. So those are key conditions to New U's obligation to move forward with the transaction at closing. There are also conditions of the seller to close, but those are fairly standard, would include that the buyer's reps are true and correct, the buyer has performed its obligations under the purchase agreement, and similarly, assurances from U.S. Department of Education relating to, no obligation of seller under Title IV post-closing, and then the closing of delivery documents. So I will pause there before I move on to what is a fairly extensive set of representations and warranties.
Are there any questions at this point?
Just one, Dr. Clark.
Yes.
So given that extensive list of conditions to close, what is the gating item that would kind of drive the timeline between signing an APA and actually closing the transaction?
The longest lead time item will be the HLC accreditor approval. And we expect that would be no sooner than, let's say, November, December timeframe. But we expect that other conditions will be satisfied in the interim.
Other questions? Go ahead, please.
As been mentioned, the buyer here has negotiated a fairly extensive set of representations and warranties from the seller. I'm going to go through these and kind of maybe call out some that are a little bit more than others, but basic representations such as reorganize has the power to do it, to do what it's doing. There are representations concerning activities that have occurred since the last balance sheet date, which was due diligence in the process to make sure that there have not been any sort of actions that would have materially diminished value. There are representations concerning the material contracts of Phoenix and their binding nature. There's representations concerning valid and marketable title to the assets, and that the assets that New U is getting constitute all of the assets that are required to operate the business post-closing. There's representations concerning the real estate leases, the litigation, a compliance with law, specifically compliance with environmental law. Then moving on to intellectual property, recognizing the nature of the business. There are extensive representations and warranties on intellectual property. Importantly, that the seller owns the intellectual property and has protected its rights, and that the inbound and outbound licenses with respect to its intellectual property are valid and binding, and that it owns or otherwise has the rights to use all of the IP necessary to operate its business.
Does that include from a technology standpoint that there are going to be agreements with outside vendors as it relates to sort of the chassis for them providing the online programs, that those agreements are not subject to termination and non-renewal or price change or whatever, a change of control?
Yeah, there are representations concerning that, and to the extent that any of those contracts require consent in order to transfer, those consents must be received prior to closing.
Okay.
There will also be reps and warranties concerning non-infringement as it relates to any third-party IP rights, and also that any open source software used by seller does not violate licensing terms. Next, there's an extensive set of representations and warranties on education regulatory matters. Notably that the seller is in compliance with regulatory requirements relating to Title IV, civil rights laws, all material education laws, VA requirements, Department of Defense requirements, pandemic relief, and the like. The next key set relates to HR and benefits. There will be obviously a number of employees that will be coming in on the transaction and will become employees of New U. And so there will be an effort made to kind of replicate the benefit plans and whatnot that are currently existing at Phoenix. And so representations and warranties will be made relative to the maintenance of benefit plans in accordance with all laws, maintaining qualified status where necessary, that there's been no penalties under ERISA or the Internal Revenue Code, that the premiums and benefits have been timely paid, that the seller does not expect to incur liabilities under ERISA, premiums to the PBGC, which is the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, have been paid, There's no withdrawal liability under multi-employer plans. There's no liability under any sort of defined pension plans in terms of minimum funding. No reportable events under ERISA. There's no post-employment or retiree benefits. And that all employees are at will and are required to sign confidentiality and proprietary information agreements. So there's a host more that deal with compliance with all kinds of laws, including and whether or not there's no actions under EEOC and NLRA and DOL, Department of Labor, et cetera. So again, another fulsome set of rep and warranties from the seller on that.
Before we jump off of HR, President Green, can you talk about, and I don't know, stop me if this is later in the presentation, can you talk about kind of the current management team and the agreements with that management team and, retention of that team, and your impression? You mentioned at the outset that team has come in sort of post the issues that University of Phoenix had reputationally. Can you talk a little bit about, keeping that team around and then the kind of the tenor and makeup of that?
Yeah, I've made it clear to them that that the University of Idaho and our regents, want to ensure that we are, buying a business that's a going concern, and that we want all those employees to come over with us. And of course, the new entity will not be a private for-profit entity. It's going to be a not-for-profit and eventually be a public entity with approval of the Department of Education. So, we want to make sure that we continue to compensate those people at a level where they want to come to work for the new entity. So we're doing our best to replicate. Obviously, since we're not a private entity or a for-profit, we don't have equity. So what we agreed to is, should you approve this transaction before closing, we will take a look at. We'll have experts take a look at the compensation system and just ensure that we're doing everything we can that within reason to ensure that we get key employees over and make sure that the full workforce is appropriately compensated.
Are there other questions?
Maybe just a follow-up to that. So just, Scott, in your conversations with them, is that leadership team excited about the opportunity that could occur as a not-for-profit, or are they more motivated as pure capitalists and would prefer to stay as a for-profit entity? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah,
they are different cultures.
I do, but I think I mentioned earlier the longevity of the team, of the faculty, and the main workforce. The new, I believe we'll be able to maintain those folks, and I would say the new management team, again, when we met with them, these are just good people. And it's interesting. The first thing they didn't talk about with us was price, or would they have their jobs, or anything like that. They talked about their students, and we really like that. So they seem really committed to the programs. They're very proud of what they've produced. They're proud of their systems. They're proud of their skill-based approach to developing programs. They're far ahead of pretty much anyone we've talked to. We're headed that direction too, but they're way ahead of us even on that. So it's just, we were just very impressed with them. Tori is on the line as well, our provost. He's also had a chance to meet. Tori, would you like to add anything to that?
Sure, President Green. Thank you. Members of the board, I agree completely with President Green. We had wonderful discussions. We jumped right into students, some of their student success initiatives, how their faculty operate, and I think it's very clear they want to continue. They were excited about joining with us. They seemed very interested in the University of Idaho, specifically how we operate, our culture, and these were exciting conversations. So I feel very confident about that.
Are there any members of the management team that you feel are at risk at post-transaction?
Well, of course, we'd like to ensure that Crystal, the CEO, continues, and their provost, who would continue. But I have to admit, we were pretty impressed with the entire senior management team. But I would say those two people in particular, I think they're pretty critical to the operation and to the successful partnership that we hope to have, the affiliation, because they have the similar vision, and we found them very easy to work with, and we're pretty excited about what we can do together.
Questions from other board members? Please go ahead.
Thank you. Just to round out the seller representations, that they will also make representations about their government contracts and that they have not been debarred or suspended or otherwise ineligible for government business. And finally, they'll make representations concerning their tax returns and that they're not subject to any sort of legal tax proceeding. The next set of representations are a little bit more customary, relating to parties that are participating in this, including representations of the buyer, New which will represent to its organization its authority to enter the contract, that there's no conflicts, that it's not subject to legal proceedings. It will make reference to the fact that it will be seeking financing, and that's essentially it for the representations of the buyer. Both AEG, which is the owner of the seller, owner of Phoenix, and University of Idaho will be making very limited representations, basically organization and authority, just because they are signatories to the agreement itself, for very, very limited purposes. The next section I'm going to move on to is covenants. These are really to distinguish them from, for example, conditions to closing. Covenants relate to primarily to the operation of the business between the period of signing and closing, and in effect, it is to try to ensure that the business is going to be in the same condition it is at closing it as today. It's no guarantee, but that they will not take any sort of measures to alter the conduct of the business. The seller will also agree to operate the business in a manner such that it maintains its accreditation, and that it will continue to provide information to the buyer for due diligence purposes between signing and closing. So there will continue to be an information flow which will help assist buyer in terms of the information necessary to really hit the ground running at closing. The seller is going to agree not to continue to try to sell the assets, and will let the buyer know if it receives any unsolicited bids. It will also provide notice of certain events if anything material or adverse occurred. They would let the buyer know. Then there are also, in addition, there's some agreements by New will offer employment to all the seller employees, and will agree to maintain salary and benefits for up to 1 year for so long as those people are employed. Phoenix currently maintains 2 foundations, which have kind of a loose affiliation with the university. And the New will not be acquiring those any obligations relating to that, and will have no obligation to those foundations going forward contractually. The buyer will agree to keep information confidential through closing, and the seller will also agree to keep information confidential through closing. Both parties will agree to obtain all necessary consents and approvals. The seller and its affiliates will agree to non-disparagement, non-compete, and non-solicit obligations that will extend post-closing for up to 5 years. The New will seek to buy a representation and warranty insurance policy, and the seller will cooperate in those efforts. That work is underway, and we would expect that would occur pretty soon after signing. The buyer will continue to seek the bridge financing for the transaction, although it will be under no obligation to use it. and the seller will assist buyer in connection with obtaining the financing for the transaction. The buyer will agree to maintain books and records and will make those available to seller for very limited purposes. It would be in the event that seller needed them for tax purposes or was involved in some sort of issue where it needed access to those books. Both parties will use reasonable efforts to satisfy closing conditions. Each party is going to be filing its own taxes. So this is an asset transaction. The seller will pay its taxes and New You will pay its taxes. The seller will stop using Phoenix's name after closing. Both parties will cooperate to get all of the ancillary agreements finalized before closing. The seller is also going to undertake a pre-closing reorganization to ensure that to the extent that there are any assets related to the business that are currently held by an affiliate of the seller, that they will be held by the university at closing. The New You will agree that it will go forward with the tax exempt status filings, and then both parties will cooperate with one another to ensure that the provisions of the agreement are carried out and that we get to a satisfactory closing. And that is it for the covenants.
Are there any questions? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Clark. The last 2 points are really very generic. There's the terms in the contract that talk about how the contract itself could be terminated, and the parties to the contract can always agree by mutual consent to terminate a contract if they choose. Other than that, the terminations are for really breach or failure to perform by either party. And then the last section are miscellaneous terms, and these are things like who gets notice under the contract, and the like that are standard to all contracts of this nature. And that really summarizes the transaction as it will be evidenced by the asset purchase agreement. And I would stand for questions.
Are there questions on anything here on the term sheet that we missed as we went through?
This is Board Member Roach, and I have a general question.
Go ahead.
President Green, has the University of Phoenix shared any outcome statistical information with regard to graduate success?
They have. I'm going to again ask our Provost Tori Lawrence, who's actually taken quite a dive into that, and ask him to comment on that question. Thank you, Regent Roach.
Regent Roach, we don't have that as part of the presentation here today, but I'd be happy to get details for you on their success rates with employment after graduation. Absolutely.
And I think you did, Tori, if I recall, you did take a look at their graduation rates compared to other online institutions, and can you share that a little bit about that?
Sure. We often look at 4-year graduation rates, 6-year graduation rates, but this is really not a great metric for this institution. Most of their students are adult learners who have families, they're working full time, and frankly, they're taking 1 or 2 classes at a time. Not all, but most. And so looking at a 4-year graduation rate for part-time students or a 6-year graduation rate really isn't a great measurement. They look carefully, and this was part of our discussion with the leadership team, at their continuation rates and other ways of assessing student success. And I'd be happy to gather as much of that information as you'd like to see.
This is Board Member Roach again, and I just say that many adult learners or people out in the workforce don't have the opportunity to stop their career and go to the University of Idaho or another university, and they do have to continue to work. And so I would just say that this type of situation is a great opportunity for many adult learners. And I have received some questions over the last 24 hours since this announcement came out about the University of Idaho offers prestigious degrees. And how does that compare to the University of Phoenix and their degrees? And sometimes online degrees are not viewed as highly as a university degree, but I would beg to differ with that and say that for a person who doesn't have other opportunities, and the fact that employers need employees, they need skilled workers, and with the lack of availability, this provides a great benefit for both business and employees and students. So I'm very supportive of this this opportunity that we have here today. Thank you, Tori.
Thank you, Trustee Roach. Other comments or questions?
Board Member Clark, can I, or President Clark, can I just respond briefly to Board Member
Yes,
Roach's comment?
of course.
I think the question about reputation and degrees and quality of online degrees, I think we need to point out they're accredited by HLC, and they've been accredited since their founding in 1976. They just went through their large review cycle just recently and passed with flying colors. And I think that's a great testament to the quality of what they're doing. Carefully at student learning outcomes and success rates. And I think that's a great sign of what they're doing. I couldn't agree with you more about the adult learners. This is a population that is not our focus. And so that's part of the excitement about this opportunity, is aligning with an institution with frankly, a pretty different target audience for students. And I think that's something that'll benefit the university and certainly Idaho.
Thank you. I would just add, it is very much in alignment with the recommendations made from the Higher Ed Task Force, which President Green mentioned, both in terms of expanding the offerings to include adult learners, but also, and importantly in this state, leveling the playing field, making sure that your address doesn't determine what access you have to programs and training. And this would move us light years toward that goal. Other questions or comments?
I don't know if that's where we're going next, President Clark, but if that's what we could talk about is, whether it's President Green or others, how this can be used for other citizens across Idaho, how this could relate to our Advanced Opportunities Program, building a statewide, digital system. I don't know if that's where we're going in this, but I'd like to get to that discussion as well.
Yeah. So I was going to talk.
Go ahead, President Green.
Thank you, President Clark. I will talk about value proposition and particularly we can get into some more details. Because it sounds like you'd like to go there, Board Member Gilbert. But I think you can see that we didn't go into this very lightheartedly. I mean, you've heard about all that we've negotiated into this, all the risk mitigation involved, all the reps and warranties, and I'm sorry, but we had to put you through that as a board, but I know that you feel more comfortable having been through that, and we want to ensure that you knew that we did our job. The value proposition to the state of Idaho is the opportunities to enhance affordable online education to the entire state. And I really love how President Clark talks about it, that your address doesn't, determine your access. So, we can hit, place-bound rural students and time-based working parents and augment those goals that were identified by the Higher Education Working Group. This aligns directly with that. And we can see opportunities for pathways from Phoenix to the U of I, and the opportunity, for maybe someone who's got an associate's degree who may want a bachelor's and on a destination campus, or maybe they're interested in getting their PhD at a place where you can do research, and certainly that is something that is different than what the University of Phoenix offers. On the other hand, it also provides choice to Idaho students, both at our university and elsewhere, to help them advance to their degrees. We already accept, I believe, I know it's over 500. I think the number is around 560 programs from the University of Phoenix. So that provides a lot of opportunities for our students to take advantage of that. Another opportunity is a mature platform. Their online systems are excellent. If you've been on their websites and see how they're structured and how easy it is to use, and quite frankly, their persistence systems are some of the best that we've seen. So we think that we can really leverage those systems for the benefit of both the University of Idaho and the state of Idaho. We think that they can be used throughout the education system.
President Green,
yes.
how many Idaho students are currently at the University of Phoenix? Do you have an idea?
Yeah, well, I've heard over 600, and I've heard some larger numbers, but I won't say them. But we're pretty sure that there's over 600 currently, in the system.
Would there be an opportunity for us to advantage in-state students from a cost perspective if they, if they were place bound and couldn't access one of our 4 institutions or our 4 community colleges to give them in-state price access? I mean, would this board have the authority and the ability to do that, to advantage students in Idaho?
So my legal counsel tells me there are some guardrails around that, but we certainly could put together scholarship funds for them. And I've contemplated that actually, because we do want to make education as affordable for our Idaho students as possible, because that is our constituency at the U of I. And I've actually had very brief, I have to admit, we haven't gotten into much details, but I suspect that some of that surplus revenue that could be flowing to the University of Idaho, we would direct to our foundation for that purpose.
President Green, you've talked a lot about adult learners. Do you anticipate that you can expand the dual credit program to rural Idaho in greater numbers to let students access the GEM courses?
This is one of the great opportunities I think that we have. That we've got so many more courses now that can be delivered remotely by people qualified to do that. And as you know, President Clark, one of our biggest issues in our rural communities is having people with the right credentials to teach those dual credit courses. So we see a lot of opportunity there. And more opportunities keep coming out of the woodwork. Since we started talking about this with our faculty and others, I can't tell you, we've gotten a number of emails of people who want to help and their ideas that they're thinking about and how they can align with this. And it's pretty exciting.
We interrupted you. We didn't let you get all the way through your slide. Do you want to finish?
This is so much better conversation than my slides. So it's more exciting. So I appreciate the questions. The transaction, just to finish off, the transaction will generate significant cash flow. And we know both on EBITDA, it's over 150 million and free cash flow, roughly 100 million. So chances of us ever having to be called on any guarantees or anything are very low. So from our perspective, for all the reasons we've been discussing here, this is a good business decision, not only for the University of Idaho, but for the state of Idaho. So with that, I'm not going to waste more of your time. I'd rather you ask questions. So I'll stop there. That's the end of our presentation. And if you have any other questions or comments, please provide them and we'll do our best to answer.
Thank you. Are there questions or comments from board members?
Guess I have one question or comment that maybe you could just react to. So since this became public 24 hours ago at the board office, we've received a number of letters, and I'm sure as all my fellow board members did, I've read every one of them. And I was just kind of trying to put them into buckets of areas of question or concern. And there were kind of 3 that jumped out at me. One is, are we taking on reputational risk if we do this transaction because of some of the prior missteps that University of Phoenix made that you touched on earlier? That was one. 2, there have been some letters from faculty where we do have a shared governance model in our institutions. And so there have been some concerns raised by specific faculty around, hey, why weren't we brought into this decision process? And then 3rd, there's been a lot of just concern from the public around, there hasn't been really much opportunity for public input before we got here today. So maybe, Scott, if you could just comment on those 3 and share with us your perspective on some of the feedback we're getting from many members across Idaho.
Yeah. So I'll start with reputational risk. we knew there would be folks, because we saw what happened at the University of Arkansas and elsewhere, and how private universities are viewed in the country. And what I can say to that is yes, there is reputational risk that comes with that, as long as they're a private entity and looking for shareholders, as opposed to the primary view being the students. As I mentioned earlier, what I like about this new management team is again, their focus on the students, and they want to be a not-for-profit public institution, because that helps them focus on their students. And so we think they're very, very good people. We understand there's been problems in the past, and people were rightly upset with them, for past behaviors. But it is our opinion in dealing with them and going through our due diligence that they're on a very different path now. We recognize that, as long as they are a private institution and until the Department of Education would recognize them as a public, there is some reputational risk there, because all private institutions are under attack. And so we are prepared to live with that at the University of Idaho. We're not afraid of it, because we are comfortable with who they are, and we know we can help them. So that's the first part. The governance issue is a hard one, because we want our faculty to have input into pretty much everything we do. Everything we do is structured usually around working groups and includes faculty representation. This one was harder because of the NDAs that are in place. And it's not unusual to have NDAs in place on transactions like this, because oftentimes if they do go public, people who have a political point of view, for or against, start lining up, and it becomes a battleground. And so sellers often require this. And in this case, the sellers required it of us, and we were under a very strict NDA. We did bring in, leadership of the faculty senate to help us with evaluating as best they could. Frankly, I think they would have liked to have brought more of their senate in. We would have liked to as well. But again, we were under some pretty strict NDAs, and as was anyone we really brought into this deal. So the minute we talked to anyone about this, we had to read them in and make sure that they were complying with what we set out, what the seller set out for us. So that was the only way we're going to get to talk about this deal, is to agree to those NDA terms. So it was, I regret it, but there's not a lot we could have done differently. And so I just want our faculty to know that, and let them also know that, and many of them have already reached out in a positive way. I know you probably get the negative ones. I get the positive ones. That's probably part of our role, each of our role. But we've got many reach out positive. They're excited about this and want to work towards the next steps and help us assess, pathways and how we can make all this work. And that will happen. We'll make that commitment to our faculty. Finally, the public input, is a difficult one, but again, we've been very transparent, and in fact, other than one local newspaper there, everyone's really kind of taken a look at our frequently asked questions and all we've published, and couldn't believe the degree of transparency that we have out there. So I would encourage everybody to read the frequently asked questions. And if the question that you're asking is not there, we will be happy to research it and put it out there. And we want feedback, all the way to closing. We welcome it, and how we can do things differently or better. We're always open to that. Just understand that we want what's best for the state of Idaho and the education of our students in Idaho. So everything that we're doing is through that lens, and we want to just get better. So we welcome the feedback. Hopefully that answers those questions, Board Member Liebig.
Other questions or comments, Superintendent?
Thank you. President Green, this is a little more or an offshoot of the first question of Kurt, and you can give me the short-term answer. If I recall correctly, pardon me, as part of the covenants, that as you were detailing the various steps, that as of the purchase, then the university can no longer use the name the University of Phoenix, the University of Idaho. Is that, did I hear that correctly? The seller can no longer use that name. Okay, so then as far as the branding coming from the University of Idaho, what does that look like on your end?
Yeah, so we both institutions will continue to operate as they are. We do see a lot of synergies and programs and others that we can do together, but we're not looking to turn the University of Phoenix into the University of Idaho or vice versa. We see this as an opportunity for us to affiliate in a way that we can leverage the strengths of both institutions. There may be a time when, in your good judgment, you say, well, we want to supposedly, merge these or partial parts of them more than we're planning to now. But those are, the reason we structure it this way is this gives us time to think through that and evaluate that. So from a marketing perspective at this point in time, we're separate entities, but we will affiliate and we will work together, and we may go to market together on certain online programs. But I can't see us, someone asked, well, are all University of Phoenix alums going to become, alumni of the University of Idaho? No. Even though we'd love for them to show up to our football games, we would love that. That would be terrific. Will University of Idaho offer University of Phoenix degrees, or will the University of Phoenix offer University of Idaho degrees? No. Those are controlled by our respective faculty. So, for the time being, this really will, if we were to close on a Friday, everyone will show up on Monday and not see a lot of difference. It'll be over time as we start to take advantage of these platforms and start to leverage each other's programs that provide choice to Idaho's students. I think you'll see, those benefits coming through, but not necessarily on the marketing side.
Related to that, President Clark, President Green, related to that, there are a couple of national models. As speaking to what you're talking about, can you talk about how you sort of think about those that have been in place for a while, whether that's Purdue or others, and how how you look at this opportunity and this combination, and would replicate things that have been successful there or do it differently?
Yeah. So one of the big criticisms about some of the other institutions that have done this is that some of the prior sellers had still operational support of some of those units, and we get that criticism. This is going to be a clean break, and this was wanted both by the sellers and by us. We don't want the sellers involved after this deal closes because, frankly, conflict of interest, but also there's no reason for them to be, because they're private equity funds, and they're going to be closing their fund. They want out of the investment. They want to give the return to the shareholders and move on. And the University of Phoenix would like them to move on, and they would like to become a public institution and not for profit, so they don't have to worry about shareholders and they can worry about their students. So that's the model we're moving to. As far as some concern that this diminishes the U of I's reputation somehow, well, I don't think Kaplan has diminished the reputation of Purdue. Purdue is a great institution. It's been incredibly well managed by Ms. Daniels for over a decade. They've done nothing but grow their enrollment, and they've got a great relationship with Kaplan. And again, I don't think it's diminished them one iota. I believe that will be the same for the University of Idaho.
Questions from board members online? Any additional questions here? Are you ready to put a motion?
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman.
If there are no more questions, yeah. I move to approve the resolution proposed by the University of Idaho, the title of which is as follows. A resolution of the Regents of the University of Idaho, A, authorizing creation of New U, Inc., and B, authorizing the acquisition of New U, Inc. of substantially all of the assets and assumption of certain liabilities of the University of Phoenix Incorporated and related transactions.
Is there a second?
Second motion.
Thank you. Florence, will you call the roll, please?
Can I make a comment before we?
Just, Mr. Levick wants to make another.
Yeah,
comment.
just for the benefit of the public, I just want to share my thinking on why I think this bold, innovative move by the University of Idaho makes a ton of sense. And it all starts, Dr. Clark, with you mentioned this, the task force that Governor Otter put in place, that you led with Bob Locke. And this was one of the key principles of that. This is one of the key recommendations that came out of that task force, is to create this type of delivery mechanism. And when I look at the macro trends that are going to impact higher ed, the main one being we're going to face an enrollment cliff here across the country, right? Because starting with the Great Recession back in 08, 09, Americans had fewer kids. And so that means starting in about 2025, there are going to be less students going on to college. That's compounded by the fact that we're seeing lower go-on rates since the pandemic. And so in 1 or 2 years here, the idea that we're going to be able to build enrollment with the market shrinking, I just don't see that happening. So I think we got to be bold and innovative. And as President Green said, the University of Phoenix is going after the growing market here, which is adult learners. And Board Member Roach referenced that. So if we can tap into that market and create career pathways for all Idahoans, no matter where they are in their educational journey, I think it's going to be a huge home run for this state. And, our only other option, if we don't do something bold like this, is to build it as we go. And the market's changing so fast. I don't think we could ever increment our way to a world-class platform. The only way we're going to be sort of recognized as a state, as an innovator, is to do something like this. So I'll be supporting the motion.
Do any other board members want to make comments before we go to the vote?
The only thing I would add, I'd add one thing, I think Kurt said it incredibly well, is that it really is an opportunity to advantage the citizens. And if the regents own it, if the state owns it, we have the opportunity, through NUCO, we have the opportunity to advantage the citizens of Idaho. And we have the opportunity to have an influence through that board on directionally how those programs are delivered, particularly given sort of the unique needs of Idaho. We are different than a lot of other states in the sense that we have such a significant access differential between our rural, our remote, and our more suburban schools. And so there's an opportunity to have a seat at that table now before that becomes a bigger problem, or as that becomes a bigger problem. And you combine that with the platform, with the enhancements that are coming through the broadband, initiative in the state. And it's the timing, I think, is really excellent.
Thank you. Other comments?
President Clark, this is Board Member Roach. I might just also comment that the University of Idaho has been successful with their P3 initiative. And so they've proven that they can be innovative and be successful with innovation. So I am very supportive of this resolution and this action.
Anyone else? No. All right, seeing none now. Florence, will you call the roll, please?
Sean Keogh. Dr. David Hill.
Aye.
Kurt Liebig.
Aye.
Kelly Roach.
Aye.
Cindy Sidaway.
Aye.
Dr. Linda Clark.
Aye.
Bill Gilbert.
Aye.
And Superintendent Critchfield.
Aye.
Motion carries. There being no further business, a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Seconded by Superintendent Critchfield. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Aye. I think that was an aye, not a opposed. Thank you. That adjourns our meeting.
We are going live in 10 seconds. Okay. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It's a great honor for us to invite